How have you been? Thanks for coming back to Dark Ascent. Today, we're looking at what happened when ordinary climbers took on extraordinary terrain without a Sherpa or guide. From 4 gym girls whose anchor gave out halfway up a big wall in the valley, to a married couple left stranded on a remote sandstone tower after a routine rappel went catastrophically wrong. It was the 14th of June, 2016. Yosemite Valley's south-facing granite walls catch the morning light in a way that makes everything look manageable. That morning, the temperature sat at 52 degrees, and the forecast was pushing 81 by early afternoon. Chloe Tilden was 26 and had the most experience of the 4. She'd spent 3 years climbing indoors and taken 2 beginner outdoor clinics the previous summer, both on single-pitch routes with instructors managing the anchors. When questions came up, the others naturally looked to her. Olivia Dawson was 24, about a year into gym climbing, strong for her experience level, and the one who'd been most eager to plan an outdoor trip. Emily Griffin, 25, and Caitlin Pelham, 23, had each been climbing indoors for about a year, comfortable enough on artificial walls but still new to outdoor systems. Planning a trip like this is fun, shopping for gear, swapping route links, and looking forward to finally doing it together. Sometimes everyone feeds off each other's confidence and nobody realizes what's missing. Something worth understanding before we go any further. Yosemite granite has a reputation for being some of the most reliable rock in the country, and it deserves it. But that reliability creates its own trap for new outdoor climbers. The rock rarely fails. The anchors people build on it can. At the gym, anchors are already installed, inspected, and ready to use. Outside, every decision about redundancy, equalization, and load direction falls on the climber. This route offered 2 solid bolts at each belay. What got attached to them was entirely up to whoever was standing there. The first pitch took them nearly 2 hours. Chloe led the climb, then built the belay anchor the way she'd seen it done online. One locking carabiner clipped through both bolt hangers with the rope running directly through it. It held, and that was enough for her. Olivia mentioned it looked different from what she'd read while researching the route, but Chloe dismissed the concern. The second pitch took even longer. Emily fell twice on a difficult section near the top, though Chloe caught both falls without trouble. By the time they reached the second ledge, it was afternoon, and they decided to turn around. Chloe rigged the rappel anchor the same way as before. One carabiner through both bolt hangers with no backup or equalization. As she sorted the ropes, all 4 clipped into that single anchor, their combined weight pulling sideways across the carabiner's gate. A carabiner gate is not designed to handle force from the side. That isn't an opinion, it's simply how the hardware works. Under a lateral load, the gate can roll open, even if the sleeve is locked because the force works against the mechanism itself. I think a lot of people, myself included, would have assumed a locked carabiner meant the system was secure. That's what makes this mistake so dangerous. The anchor failed without any visible or audible warning. All 4 came off the wall at the same moment, 430 feet above the valley floor. Chloe and Caitlin were closest to the edge and fell cleanly without striking the rock. Olivia and Emily were positioned farther in and hit the wall twice during the fall before reaching the ground. The entire fall lasted about 5 seconds. A pair of hikers on a nearby valley trail heard the impact and saw dust rising from the base of the wall. One ran toward the cliff while the other called for help. The emergency call came in at 12:47 that afternoon. The hikers could only describe the wall's general location, and the rough, forested terrain slowed rescuers trying to reach the base. A helicopter was dispatched, but couldn't land because of the tree cover, serving only for aerial assessment. By the time the rescue team arrived on foot, all 4 women had died from their injuries. The medical examiner later determined each had suffered fatal polytrauma from the fall. Chloe and Caitlin's injuries matched an uninterrupted free fall, while Olivia and Emily's fracture patterns showed they had struck the rock face before reaching the ground. Investigators recovered the carabiner with its gate open and the locking sleeve unthreaded, not because anyone had forgotten to lock it, but because the sideways load had forced it open. The bolts remained secure. Everything that failed had been brought up the wall by the climbers themselves. 3 of the 4 helmets recovered at the base had never been put on. One phone, its screen shattered but still powered on, was open to a tutorial on multi-pitch anchor systems. The investigation was ruled an accidental death. It's a reminder that in the outdoors, getting to the top is only half the climb. The decisions you make on the way down matter just as much. In southern Utah, a man drove out alone that weekend to a remote sandstone ridge where the upper section had never been assessed by anyone, and where a hold that feels solid doesn't always stay that way. It was the 3rd of October, 2014. Southern Utah's sandstone plateau stretched in every direction, its red and orange rock broken into ridgelines and formations that stretch further than any trail map covers. That morning it was 64 degrees. By midday, it would reach the low 80s. Curtis Main was 31. He worked remotely as a software developer and had spent the better part of 2 years using long weekends to explore the desert Southwest. 4 years of bouldering had given him real strength and a good instinct for reading rock. He'd done the popular climbing areas with established routes and other people around. At some point, that stopped being enough. He'd been reading about remote desert formations on hiking forums, places that took hours just to reach, and this trip was built around one of them. Before leaving, he put a note on the kitchen counter saying he was headed to southern Utah and expected to be back Sunday. His roommate glanced at it on the way out Friday morning and went on with his day. I kind of get it. Once you've climbed the popular spots, the next question is usually, what else is out there? And before you know it, you're loading up the car and driving farther than you ever thought you would for one climb. Something worth understanding about sandstone before we go further. From a distance it looks solid, but the outer layer weathers constantly. A hold that seems secure can break cleanly under body weight without any warning. The rock doesn't flex or creak first, it just goes. Experienced desert climbers know this, which is why they test every hold before trusting it. Curtis had spent 4 years climbing on plastic and gym-friendly rock. Sandstone was a different kind of challenge. I'll admit, I always assumed rock was just rock. I never really thought the type could make that much of a difference. Curtis drove to a trailhead Friday afternoon and camped at the base that night. The route followed a long approach hike before a Class 4 scramble up the southern face, steep enough that a fall in the wrong place would be serious. He started climbing late Saturday morning. The lower section went smoothly. The holds felt solid, the exposure was manageable, and he moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years climbing. By early afternoon, he reached the upper section of the face. The upper section was different. The rock up there was more weathered, the surface layer looser, and the angle steepened slightly as it approached the ridgeline. He was maybe 80 feet below the top when he reached a section that required a long reach to the right, to a ledge about shoulder height. He tested it with his hand. It felt solid. He weighted it and began to move his feet up. The outer edge of the ledge sheared off, cleanly under the shift in load. His right hand lost contact with the wall, and his body swung left. His left hand was on a smaller hold that was not positioned to take that kind of sudden lateral force. He came off the wall. The fall was approximately 70 feet down the southern face before the angle of the rock changed and he made first contact. The slope below that point was steep but not vertical, and he continued moving down the face for another 40 or 50 feet before coming to rest against a rock outcropping at the base of the upper section. He was alone. There was no one on the approach trail that day, no one at the trailhead, no one within several miles of the formation. His phone was in his pack, which had separated from him during the fall and come to rest about 30 feet away. His roommate waited through Sunday. When Curtis still hadn't shown up or made contact by Sunday evening, he filed a missing persons report. Without a specific location, search teams faced a vast stretch of desert backcountry. His car was found at the trailhead late Monday afternoon, narrowing the search enough for a ground team to reach the formation Tuesday morning. Curtis was found at the base of the upper section of the southern face. The medical examiner's report listed blunt force trauma as the cause of death, with injuries to the skull, left shoulder, and pelvis. Based on the injury pattern and where he came to rest, investigators determined that death had most likely occurred at or shortly after the initial impact. He had not survived long enough to reach his pack or his phone. What the investigation kept coming back to was the note on the kitchen counter. Southern Utah, back Sunday. A search that covered hundreds of square miles of terrain had been running for 2 days before his car at a trailhead gave them anything specific to work with. The formation he was climbing had no permit requirement. The investigation closed shortly after the recovery, ruled accidental, with no outstanding questions about what had happened or why. Isn't it strange how some of the most beautiful places can also be the least forgiving? In the Pacific Northwest, 2 brothers started up a glaciated volcano that summer, not knowing what that kind of altitude actually does to a body and how little fitness has to do with it. It was the 22nd of August, 2017. The volcano towered more than 14,000 feet above the surrounding landscape, its upper slopes buried beneath permanent ice. From the trailhead, the summit looked deceptively close. It was 68 degrees under a clear morning sky. Dustin Cranston was 34. He'd been climbing indoors for nearly a decade and had summited 2 non-glaciated peaks in the range the previous summer. After a few successful climbs, he'd started thinking of himself as a mountaineer. His younger brother Kyle was 30, a competitive cyclist with exceptional fitness, but less outdoor climbing experience. The brothers had spent months preparing for this climb, carefully researching and buying the right boots, crampons, and ice axes. What they hadn't prepared for was how altitude affects the body. It's easy to keep your eyes on the mountain. What's happening inside your body is another story. Above 10,000 feet, the drop in air pressure means each breath delivers far less oxygen than it would at sea level. The body can adapt, but only with time. High-altitude pulmonary edema develops when someone gains elevation faster than they can acclimatize, allowing fluid to build up in the lungs. Early symptoms, a dry cough, shortness of breath, a heavy feeling in the chest, are easy to mistake for normal fatigue. By the time they're unmistakable, the condition is already serious, and the only effective treatment is to descend quickly. They left the trailhead at 2 in the morning so they could cross the glacier while the snow was still firm. The climb went smoothly, and they reached the crater rim around 9. Kyle had been coughing since about 11,000 feet, but neither of them thought much of it. At the rim, he sat down and said he felt unusually heavy. Dustin suggested they rest before heading back down. I really found it refreshing that, unlike a lot of the other stories I've covered, they stopped to rest instead of pushing straight for the summit. Whether that would be enough was another question. The cough changed around 11,000 feet during the descent. It became wet, and Kyle had to stop every 50 or 60 feet to catch his breath. By 10,000 feet, he could no longer keep moving. Dustin helped him into an emergency bivy while a weather system rolled in. By early afternoon, the temperature had dropped to 31 degrees with strong winds. There was no phone signal. Dustin stayed. Kyle's condition kept deteriorating through the afternoon. His breathing became a wet, rattling sound, audible from several feet away. He was still conscious, but increasingly confused, responding slowly to simple questions. Dustin tried repeatedly to get him upright and moving, but Kyle couldn't support his own weight. The slope was too steep and the snow too unstable for Dustin to carry him. By early evening, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. Dustin had given Kyle every extra layer he was carrying and had been shivering badly himself for hours. He decided to go for help. After tucking the bivvy around Kyle as tightly as he could, Dustin memorized the nearby rock formations and started down. In the dark, the mountain looked completely different. After a few hundred yards, he realized he was losing his sense of direction and stopped. He found a shallow depression in the rock just off the snow, pulled his remaining gear around him, and stayed there through the night. It wasn't much of a shelter, but it kept the wind off him. Kyle died sometime during those hours. The exact time was never established. The next morning, 3 climbers descending a nearby route noticed Dustin's erratic tracks in the snow and followed them until they found him at around 8,900 feet. They carried a satellite communicator and called for help. Dustin was evacuated first. Search teams found Kyle about 40 minutes later, still inside the bivvy at 9,200 feet. The weather had cleared enough overnight for a helicopter to reach the area by mid-morning. The medical examiner determined that fluid had accumulated in both lungs to the point that breathing became progressively ineffective over several hours. Hypothermia contributed, but the high-altitude pulmonary edema had already become the primary cause. Investigators later reviewed photos from Dustin's camera and found Kyle had been visibly struggling much earlier than either brother realized. At around 11,200 feet, he already appeared pale, hunched over, and was clearly laboring. By Dustin's own account, the cough had started around 11,000 feet. The warning signs had been there for hours. By the time they understood what was happening, there was no longer anything Dustin could realistically do alone at that elevation in deteriorating weather. This story definitely made me look at altitude a little differently. It's not just part of the scenery. 14 miles from the nearest trailhead in western Wyoming, 3 sport climbers were moving through the alpine terrain where even a single loose rock was dangerous. It was the 9th of July, 2013. The Wind River Range in western Wyoming is so remote that reaching its central peaks takes a full day of hiking. That morning, the temperature at camp was 44 degrees under a cloudless blue sky. Clint Santon was 29, Philip Decker was 31, and Manny Solberg was 28. All 3 had spent years sport climbing on bolted routes, comfortable on grades up to 512 and used to exposure. The Wind River trip was Clint's idea, something he'd been building toward after reading about the range's remote ridgelines. The plan was to traverse a high ridge, connecting 2 named peaks on the 3rd day of a 5-day trip. None of them had much experience on unroped alpine terrain, and the difference between a developed sport crag and a remote alpine ridge isn't always obvious until you're already on one. I always pictured climbing as one thing, but the more I learn about it, the more it feels like a bunch of different sports under the same name. Something worth understanding before we go further. Much of the central Wind River Range is granite and quartzite. While the granite is generally reliable, quartzite fractures along natural plains that aren't always visible, and early summer freeze-thaw cycles constantly loosen blocks that can look perfectly solid. At a sport crag, loose rock above a route has often been cleaned by the people who established it. On a remote alpine ridge that sees only a handful of climbers each year, nobody has done that work. The rock above you is exactly as the last winter left it. They had been moving along the ridge for about 4 hours when the terrain steepened into a short, technical section, about 60 feet of hands-on climbing before the ridge leveled out again. They decided to move through it one at a time. Clint went first and reached the ledge without trouble. Manny started up behind him. About 30 feet up, his left hand closed around a block of quartzite, roughly the size of a car battery, resting in a shallow depression. It looked solid. It probably had for years. The block rolled outward off the face and dropped in an arc that carried it away from the wall. Philip was waiting at the base for his turn. The rock struck the upper left side of his head and shoulder, knocking him off his feet and onto the rocky ledge below. Manny felt the block shift and pressed himself against the wall. He heard the impact before he saw what had happened. He down-climbed as quickly as he safely could, while Clint returned from above. Philip was unconscious, breathing but unresponsive. There was heavy bleeding from the head wound. They kept Philip still, kept his airway clear, and Manny activated the SOS on their satellite communicator at around 11 that morning. The problem was not the response. A rescue team was notified within minutes of the signal going out, and a helicopter was dispatched. The problem was the terrain. The ridge offered no viable landing zone, and the helicopter crew could not get close enough to be useful. They relayed the position to a ground team and turned back. I think we sometimes picture rescue as the moment someone answers the call. Out there, that's only the beginning. The ground team had to come in on foot, 14 miles of backcountry terrain, and they reached Clint and Manny at around 8 that evening, roughly 11 hours after the SOS went out. Philip had not regained consciousness in that time. It hadn't been enough to change what was happening inside his skull. The evacuation was done on a litter, carried by the ground team. 14 miles of Wind River, backcountry in the dark, on terrain that does not move quickly, even in daylight. Philip died during the carryout, before the team reached the trailhead. The medical examiner's report as a severe traumatic brain injury from a single high-force impact to the upper left side of the skull. The left clavicle and 2 ribs were fractured in the same impact, but those injuries were not what killed him. The brain injury was unsurvivable, regardless of how quickly help had arrived, a detail that the report noted plainly, and that did nothing to make the 9-hour wait feel any less long in retrospect. Clint and Manny were both physically uninjured. They gave full accounts to investigators over the following days, and their versions of events were consistent with each other throughout. The investigation did not find any contributing factors beyond the nature of the terrain and the group's unfamiliarity with the specific hazards of unroped alpine climbing. It was ruled accidental. Manny kept the satellite communicator. It's strange how one rock that looked solid for years could change the lives of 3 people in a matter of seconds. On a sandstone tower in northern New Mexico that May, a married couple with years of gym climbing behind them were about to find out how much difference there is between a developed crag and building your own anchor from scratch. It was the 2nd of May, 2015. A 230-foot sandstone tower stood alone on a remote mesa in northern New Mexico. That morning it was 57 degrees and completely still. Warren Corwin was 38 and his wife Lana was 36. They had met at an indoor climbing gym, and climbing had stayed at the center of their lives ever since. Warren was the planner, the one who read gear manuals and kept notes on descents before trips, meticulous enough that Lana trusted his technical decisions. Lana was the stronger climber, more comfortable with exposure and willing to push harder grades. They'd spent years climbing established outdoor routes with fixed anchors and rappel stations already in place. The tower in New Mexico would be the first time they'd build their own rappel anchor from scratch. Warren had researched the descent and kept notes in a small notebook in his pack. I also found myself thinking about how much trust climbing partners put in each other. A lot of the time, that's exactly how it has to work. Sandstone towers in the southwest are different from the granite and limestone walls many climbers start on. The rock is softer and weathers constantly, becoming less reliable the higher you climb. The summit is usually the most exposed to wind and temperature changes, and the rock reflects that. More importantly, the anchors on a remote sandstone tower are only as good as whoever placed them and whenever they were placed. On a formation 11 miles from the nearest road, that information is rarely available. The climb went well, the route was within their ability, the rock was dry, and they reached the summit by mid-morning. The top of the tower was about the size of a large dining table, flat and completely exposed. Warren photographed the view, while Lana looked over the south face where the rappel anchor was located. 2 old bolts with rusted hangers. Warren tested them by hand and they felt solid. He threaded the rope through the anchor rings, set up his tube-style rappel device, pulled on the rope to test the friction, locked the carabiner, and backed over the edge. Lana clipped into the anchor and watched the rope feed out below her. The first 110 feet went smoothly. The friction felt normal, the wall was clean and vertical, and Warren moved at a steady pace. At 110 feet, the rope configuration inside the device reached the point where the threading error became critical. The friction dropped away completely. The rope fed through the device without resistance, and Warren fell the remaining 120 feet to the desert floor. Lana felt the rope go slack. She called his name. The rope hung free below the anchor and nothing came back up from the base of the wall. She was 230 feet above the desert floor on a surface the size of a dining table with no way down. She called for help. The call came in at 11:22 in the morning. Lana described her location clearly enough that the rescue team had a starting point. The drive out on unpaved roads took an hour and 40 minutes. Warren was at the base of the south face when they arrived. A technical team went up the route and lowered Lana on a separate system. She had been on that summit for just under 4 hours. What those 4 hours were like for Lana is not something the investigation captured. The official record has the call time, the response time, the recovery, and the findings. It does not have what it is like to stand on a platform the size of a dining table, 230 feet above the ground, knowing that the person you came with is at the bottom and not moving. That part belongs to her. That earlier thought about trust hit differently by the end of this story. You rely on each other because you have to. Sometimes that also means carrying questions you'll never get to answer. Warren's cause of death was multiple traumatic injuries from the fall, unsurvivable at that distance onto desert rock. The rappel device was still attached to his harness when he was recovered. A technical review identified the threading error and reconstructed the point in the descent where the friction had failed. It wasn't an obvious mistake. It was the kind that can happen on a device you've used correctly dozens of times because the incorrect setup looks almost identical to the correct one. Warren's notebook was in his pack. Notes on the anchor, the bolt condition, the descent route, nothing about the rappel setup. There had been no second check of the device before he went over the edge. The investigation closed as accidental death. The bolts had held. The anchor had held. The only failure was the way the device had been threaded, a mistake that took less than a minute to make and 230 feet to reveal itself. I think the biggest thing I took away from this one is that no matter how experienced you are, the basics never stop mattering. If there are any climbers watching, I'd love to hear from you. What's the one safety habit you never skip?